Mr. President, you and I are fairly new to this chamber, and I know that the Senate rules prevent me from engaging in anyone who happens to be in the gallery, so I won't do that. But I do have to admit, just watching what's gone on here for the last 15 or 20 minutes, I can't help but think at least one or two of them are saying, what on earth is going on down on that Senate floor? We've heard arguments embedded in arguments. The issue before us that we have today is on the GMO vote. We heard about judges. Look, everybody says that we're in gridlock here. There are obviously instances where we disagree. Let's set those aside and then address issues where we do agree we have pressing issues. And we have two of those before the Senate floor today. The one immediately before us is on GMO labeling, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. The other one has to do with funding Zika. It has to do with trying to understand why some 38 members of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle voted for $1.1 billion in Zika funding. And now it's back before us. It's one vote away from going to the president's desk. And now they're all voting against it. Collectively, the members who voted for it, for the $1.1 million, and now voted against it, represent states that have 671 Zika cases reported to date. That looks like we're going to be here a little bit tonight, and I'll get into details there and share the roll call vote. But today I want to talk about GMO. And I first want to start by thanking Senator Roberts and Senator Stabenow for the work they did for a bipartisan solution to this bill. We voted on cloture yesterday. We had a majority of over 60, I think 65 members vote. What cloture means is to get on the bill. Now we're on the bill. What does this bill do? What it's trying to do is avoid the confusion and the cost when a state implements a law that becomes de facto federal law of the land and increases the cost of prices to consumers. This right here is what we're proposing in the language that we have before us that I hope we vote on and hope we focus on. This is only one choice of one state, the state of Vermont. There are several dozen states who plan to have their own variants, and I'll talk about the absurd exemptions and exceptions later on. Bottom line, complexity creates cost. Cost to the American consumer. In Vermont alone, the Vermont law will increase the average cost per household in Vermont alone by about $2,000 a year. There are people struggling to pay for the food that they have. There are people right now that are trying to decide, do they pay to heat their home or eat? And now we're talking about raising it for some of the poorest people up $2,000 a year. Complexity equates to cost. This provides clarity, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I do really appreciate Senator Roberts and Senator Stabenow for getting those of us who are willing to work together, who are willing to say to people at either end of the spectrum, guys, we're going to come up with a compromise and solve this problem. We have that opportunity before us now, and I hope that we'll get to an affirmative vote later today. But we've got to get to something simple. Now, I think that, as I said earlier, the state-by-state patchwork, if you imagine this is what Vermont decided to do. What about California? What about my state of North Carolina? All the other ones. Some people say, well, you're preempting state law. When a state law affects interstate commerce across the nation, because if I'm a Campbell's Soup or a Kellogg's or a small mom and pop shop trying to distribute in Vermont, if I don't get their labeling exactly right, I could be subject to millions of dollars of fines just because I have a jar or a can or a box on a customer's shelf that isn't consistent with their labels. In North Carolina, I live in Charlotte. Charlotte and South Carolina, Charlotte's right on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina. You have a truck carrying cans that one can of Campbell's Soup has to be labeled one way in North Carolina, another one in South Carolina. Does that make sense? It adds cost, it doesn't add value. That's why we're trying to prevent this patchwork of laws that could go on the books. Now, I want to talk a little bit about GMOs for a minute because Senator Durbin said something that I think is very important. I sat on the Agriculture Committee. I've asked the heads of the FDA, the EPA, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture all the same question in the same committee hearing several months ago. I said, do you have any scientific data whatsoever that would suggest, and let's go to the FDA first, Food and Drug Administration, that would suggest that GMOs represent any threat to health? The FDA, appointed by the Obama administration leader, said none whatsoever. Then I moved to the EPA. the Environmental Protection Agency. I asked precisely the same question. I got precisely the same answer. And then I went to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I asked precisely the same question, got precisely the same answer. When you walk the halls here, people say, Tom, I know that they're safe, but for some reason we've lost the argument. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason we can't lose the argument on agriculture biotech, what some people call GMO, is because our nation and our world's food supply relies on it. 98% of all the corn that's grown in Iowa is grown as a result of GMO. Not some sort of Frankencorn, corn that's heat resistant, corn that's moisture resistant, fungus resistant. If we were to go back and roll back 30 or 40 years of progress in agriculture biotech and take it out of our food supply chain, we could literally be in a position where people will starve. Maybe not in the United States, but to all the nations we export to, because we simply cannot produce the world's food supply if we go back 10, 20, or 30 years. So it's a very important part of our food supply. It's a safe food, it's an environmentally sound food, and it's one that we just have to understand. Now, having said that, I firmly believe that everybody has a right to know what's in their food. That's why I love the compromise bill that Senator Roberts and Senator Stabenow have got before us today. It's pretty simple. Now, again, I know I can't interact with the gallery, so I won't. But my guess is most of the people in the gallery that are over the age of about 12 have a smartphone. One or two of you may have flip phones, and there's an alternative for that I'll talk about, but most of you probably have smartphones. As a matter of fact, 207 million people in the United States have smartphones. Many of them come with I know Senator Durbin's not familiar with it, but it's called a QR code reader. A QR code reader. I'm going to give you all a chance, if you're watching from home, to actually scan it while you're hearing me talk live. Everybody does. To me, I remember, I think it was Senator or President Bush back in the 90s when he went through a shopping line and he was astounded because he saw a barcode reader. He said, wow, that's new technology. It'd been around a while. Well, guess what, folks? QR codes have been around a while. As a matter of fact, yesterday when the distinguished gentleman from Oregon spoke, he had a QR code up on the screen. I said, heck, I want to see what that is. So I clicked on the QR code that was on the Campbell's can. It brought up on Wikipedia the history of the New York Yankees, but it proves the point that you can go directly from that QR code to the internet and get the information you need real time. What's the other advantage of these QR codes? You can board an airplane with them. You can get information on your fuel. You can get medical services. It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. It's prevalent. Everywhere you go, you see them. And when I go to the store, because my wife is pretty strict on how much money I can spend, I'll scan a QR code to see if I can find a comparative shop, and maybe I need to go down the street and buy that same product. It's an integral part of our life, in other words. For somebody to say it's new, weird, different, hard to use, it only takes one button, one click on your phone to actually get to the rich information on the internet. That's what this bill is about. So, what if that QR code was on a product, a can of soup, a bag of flour, any product that you'd buy in the grocery store that's subject to this law? You'd go to your phone, you'd hit QR code reader, which is on your smartphone, and it would immediately bring you to a website. This is what this proposed law requires. It immediately brings you to this website. In the cases that I've done it, 2 or 3 seconds. The minute you get to this website, you get all kinds of information. You get nutritional information, caloric value, all the kinds of things you need to know what's in your food. Right on this page, you can click down and you can see whether or not it has any GMO or agriculture biotech content. And then you can even drill down further and find out what that means. It's in this bill. It can be done. Small businesses use this. Political people use this. Everybody uses this as a way to rapidly get to the internet. Not about you all, but I think this internet thing is going to take off. I think it's going to be here a while. So I think we're going to become increasingly comfortable with this sort of way to get the most rich information available to the food that we're going to eat. So for those who say this is some sort of weird code or outdated, I don't know if they're about you all, but that's not the world that I live in. And I think it's a very effective way to get it. But let's assume that you're a small business and you don't have the ability to create a QR code. Frankly, I would tell that small business, do it, because that creates a competitive advantage. That makes you look as big as Campbell's Soup, lets you compete. Easy to put up a website. Most of us have them, or most of us know how to get them up pretty easily. I can put one up in 2 or 3 hours and then have a QR code to go to it. But let's assume they don't want to do it. It's a mom and pop shop and they just don't like QR code readers. You can have a 1-800 number if you satisfy a certain threshold. For more product information, call this number, and they have a statutory obligation to disclose to you the contents of the food, whether or not it has any GMO products in it. You can also, if you don't want to do the 1-800 number, you can just do a simple web address. Key in, tomscornerstore.com or whatever, and get to the same information. So the fact of the matter is this bill does that. It fully discloses, and it creates a statutory requirement that says that the food manufacturer must disclose the content of their food, nutritional information, GMO content, etc. Now, the bill also is mandatory. I mean, there were disagreements on our side because we had members on our side of the aisle that said they didn't like mandatory. We decided, in the interest of compromise, to accept a mandatory requirement. It takes 2 years before the rules are made, and about 3 years before most businesses will have to be fully phased in. A good glide path for getting there, and quite honestly, most of the manufacturers are going to do it because they understand, like I do, the advantage of quick access to having a consumer get to their web presence. There are other things that they can do once they get there. So, we know that with QR code, we know URLs, we know that 1-800 numbers work. We know that everybody deserves the right to know what's in their food. This law mandates that that happens. Mandates that that happens. It eliminates the absurd exceptions and exemptions. And go ahead and put this other code up. I'll give anybody that wants to do this, I know this code works. If you're at home right now and you see this code, you should be able to take your QR code scanner, go right up to your TV, just like I did yesterday, and go out to this website and see in real time what I just demonstrated on the prior slide. Why do we need to do this? Why do we need a federal consistent framework for doing this? Why is it federal government's goal to get involved in this? Because, back to the first slide, I don't want the people in Vermont to pay an average of $2,000 a year for their food. I don't want people in North Carolina to pay an average of $1,100 a year for the same food that they bought last year, only because of these federally mandated, or I should say state mandated, labeling requirements. Now, let me give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about in the Vermont law. Just imagine if this was multiplied by 2 or 3 dozen other states. Frozen pepperoni pizza is exempt from the Vermont law. Frozen cheese pizza has to be labeled. Vegetable beef soup is exempt from the Vermont law. Vegetable soup has to be labeled. Multiply that by dozens and dozens and dozens of other states and say, well, we like delivered vegetable pizza has to be labeled, but delivered meat pizza doesn't have to be labeled. Think about all these absurd exceptions and exemptions that could occur if we have 50 state houses trying to create a patchwork of laws. The average cost now is about $1,200 a year. Imagine if we had 24, 36 different states that we had to interpret. The cost would go up, ladies and gentlemen. The food is no more nutritious. It just costs more. That's why we need a federal standard. So, to my friends on the other side of the aisle and a handful on this side of the aisle, folks, this is just common sense. Anybody should be able to figure this out on 8 hours of sleep. This is not a difficult decision. We need to solve this problem now. Then we need to get on to Zika, which I'll come back and talk about a little bit later on, and then we can get to all the other myriad things that we need to get done here. But when I came here in January of last year, I was accustomed to getting things done in the North Carolina House. This is an opportunity to get something done that makes sense, that removes the threat of raising food costs and not producing one iota increase in health outcomes. So I hope that my friends on both sides of the aisle recognize this is an opportunity where we can prove to the people in this gallery and the people in this nation we can actually get things done. This is a compromise. This is something that my friends on the right do not necessarily like, and I know some of my friends on the left don't like, but it's right. And it's necessary now so that we can protect the people who don't know if this bill doesn't get passed, they're going to be paying more food for no more value. Thank you, Mr. President.